Accounting practices and the minutiae of how the provincial government borrows money became big news this week as Ontario's Auditor General Bonnie Lysyk released her report taking issue with the government's plan to pay for a 25% cut in hydro bills by borrowing. It amounts to billions in interest payments. To learn more, we're pleased to welcome the Auditor General back to our studio. Auditor, lovely to have you here again.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
This is a complicated story, so we're going to go through it slowly, take our time, and figure it all out, because recommendation number one in your, here it is right here, Fair Hydro Plan report, is that the government should record the true financial impact of the plan on the province's books. So let's start there. What, in your view, is not true about what the government has been telling us about the financial impact of their hydro rate reduction?
So the government needs to borrow to be able to pay the power generators the difference between what they collected before from the ratepayers and what they collect now. So they need to borrow. So they put in place, or they're planning to put in place, an accounting financing structure that will basically keep the impact of any of that policy decision off of the government's consolidated financial statements, and the interest expense and the loss from having to pay, borrow for that difference will not show up on any set of statements over the next 30 years.
So in essence, they're trying to keep the borrowing that will help subsidize lower hydro prices today off the books today.
The net debt impact of that, yes. And that's really important, because on public sector accounting standards for government, net debt is an indicator of the government's need to collect revenues in the future to pay off its expenses. And by not putting the transaction on there, it understates net debt. It understates, it'll understate for many years the bottom line on the government statements.
So in essence, make sure I understand, the government last spring presented what it said was a balanced budget. Is it your view that if the true financial impact of the hydro rate subsidy were included in the books, we would not have a balanced budget today? Is that fair to say?
So the policy decision took effect July 1st. So a portion of the year's impact from that decision wasn't included in the budget for 17-18. And at this point, there's no plan to include the impact of the policy decision in future budgets. So it would be correct to say that the budget in the past, the most recent one, does not reflect any financial impact of this policy decision.
So we don't have a balanced budget today then?
I would say that the impact from this transaction was not incorporated, and so the amount that will be incurred, we don't know what that is yet, because they haven't put it 100% in place.
But it's billions.
It will be, annually they're projecting about $2.5 billion. In the year that's we're talking about, it might be about $1 billion.
Okay. The Liberals have said that the accounting practices that they follow conform to the Canadian Public Accounting Standards. And therefore, what we have here is a disagreement among professionals. You have your view, they adhere to a different view, and their view they believe is just as justifiable as yours. What do you say to that?
I would say that they're wrong. I would say that the peers to assess whether or not this transaction is right are my peers, the Auditor Generals across Canada, as well as talking to the Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. So the former director of the Public Accounting Standards Board, Tim Beauchamp, looked at this with us, and we think it's wrong. We think it's wrong because government statements need to reflect all government decision making. In this case, the government made a decision that they'll have to borrow. The impact of that interest on that borrowing will never show up in their statements. They do not present net debt accurately, which is a fundamental premise of government accounting in Canada. And so the decisions that were made around the structuring actually end up even costing people more. So our question is, they created an asset through legislation. If you follow normal accounting process, you don't need legislation to create an asset. And that's what they did. And so that's why I've previously called this legislated accounting. It's the government controlling all the decision making around the accounting. If governments are allowed to pass legislation to affect accounting, then the bottom line deficit and net debt impact on financial statements can be whatever the governments want them to be.
So the bottom line here is that you think the public of Ontario are not getting an accurate indication of the state of the books.
I would say if this goes through and they put this, they use this for their accounting, that down the road you won't know whether a deficit, is a surplus, and net debt will be improperly understated.
Do they have a leg to stand on in as much as, and you help me with this here, but technically speaking, the government's not borrowing the money to give the subsidy for hydro prices, right? They've got Ontario Power Generation as their sort of partner in borrowing all of these billions of dollars to do so. And that's, I think, part of the explanation why they say it ought not to be counted on the books as a deficit.
So what they've done is, in order to get the accounting treatment they needed at sort of the OPG and IESO level in Ontario.
That's the Independent Electricity System Operator.
Correct, and Ontario Power Generation. They needed to structure the debt a certain way, or else Ontario Power Generation would have lost its status that we call an accounting, they're a government business enterprise. All their debt would have come directly on the government statements. So they had to structure so that the province will borrow directly about 44% of the debt. The remaining debt will be borrowed by OPG, and OPG Trust was the name that they were planning.
That's their justification for not putting it on the books.
That's correct, and it's at a higher expense. So when you borrow through an entity of the government versus directly through the government, chances are you're paying a higher interest rate. And I believe in the FAO's calculation of the $4 billion
Financial Accountability Officer.
Correct.
We're an acronym-free zone here, Auditor, okay?
All
right.
The Financial Accountability Officer, there was a 90 basis point spread estimate of what the difference would be if the government borrowed directly or if they had to borrow through OPG and OPG Trust.
That's a lot of bread.
It would be. I mean, it could be higher, it could be lower, depending on decisions in the future.
Now, am I right that normally when you do your audits of government spending, you do it after the policy has gone into effect and after you have something after the fact to look at? Your report this time is, if you like, a bit of a preemptive strike here, right? Because it hasn't completely gone into effect yet. So what are you doing?
So what happened when we were doing our financial statement audits? We signed off on the public accounts in August this year. During the course of our audit, we recognized that this transaction was being planned. So what happened this year is some of positioning for this transaction impacted the public accounts this year. And we did qualify the government's financial statements, not just with respect to the pension issue, but with respect to putting, setting up the statements to put a certain type of accounting on government statements that's not appropriate in Canada. And so that necessitated us to look at this even further. And the report is really, we look at it as recommending to the government, you don't have to do this. You have time to make this right. And, you know, rather than having to receive a qualified audit opinion next year on another accounting issue, please look at this. The accounting is wrong. There's no value for money in this situation.
But their response so far has been to thank you for your advice and your good work, and we're not going to take your advice, and we're going to keep it the way it was, which they're entitled to do, I guess, aren't they?
And they are. You know, government can pass legislation. They can do whatever they want in accounting. I mean, my mandate, my office's mandate, is to make sure that the public gets the correct information. And so, you know, we will comment on information that we think the public isn't getting fully. And in this case, it was through this report that we're sort of giving a heads up that the accounting is inappropriate.
I mean, I've watched Queen's Park for more years than I want to admit. And you know, almost every other government I can recall before this one, when the auditor said, you're not doing it right, you have to include this on your books, you may not like it, but if you want to be accurate, you have to. And governments in the past, even Mike Harris's government, and I don't think they were all too happy about it, said, okay, we'll do it. I mean, that's, I think, been the practice in the province of Ontario for many decades. This government is taking a different approach, which is to thank you for your advice, but we're not going to do it your way. What do you think of that?
I mean, you know, the government can do what they want to do. They can pass the legislation, they can create their own accounting rules. But the job of the Office of the Auditor General is to make the Legislative Assembly aware of this situation and to comment on it. You know, I think they knew when they were planning this transaction, when they were planning the structure, that we would have objection to it. They didn't bring it to our attention intentionally. And the mandate for the civil service that was involved in preparing this was you need to figure out how a bottom line isn't impacted and how net debt isn't impacted. And that's what we expect. And I think, you know, I think it's unfortunate, but a lot of emphasis has been put, you know, for the last 4 years on achieving a balanced budget, and that causes pressure, right? So sometimes, you know, I think maybe decision making is impacted by that promise that perhaps if it wasn't so emphatic and the numbers became what the numbers would based on the policy decisions, you know, we wouldn't be where we are right now.
But the government, you know, its fiscal credibility was very much resting on the fact that they could present a balanced budget, which they believe they have done last spring. I mean, I'll put something else to you here, which is the government rebuttal so far to your report is that if you want the cost of the Fair Hydro plan to show up on the books as if it were going to be paid by the taxpayers, when in effect, it's actually going to be paid by electricity ratepayers. Now, you and I both know that that's the same person, and it's a matter of taking the money from one pocket versus the other pocket. But technically, legally, specifically, the ratepayer and the taxpayer is not really the same thing, right? Does that make a difference to you?
It does. It does. It is important, you know, for to keep costs separate because, you know, one doesn't subsidize the other. But these are policy decisions. At the end of the day, the government statements reflect both the decisions for the electricity industry as well as for just taxpayers in general. There still is, you can still track ratepayer costs separately than taxpayer costs. You don't need to put in place this accounting structure to do that.
Here's, you read the Toronto Star from time to time, I bet. Did you read Martin Redcon's column the other day?
Yes, I did.
You did. He didn't like what you did. Anyway, I'm just going to read a little excerpt here because he kind of took a shot at you here. The Auditor General's quibble, he called it, quibble, is over tactics. That the Liberals are borrowing money through Ontario Power Generation, their wholly owned electrical utility, instead of carrying it on the government's own balance sheet. The conventional narrative frames this as a political clash pitting our fearless auditor against feckless Liberal politicians. In fact, her fight, your fight, is with senior public servants, the provincial comptroller, Treasury Board staff, and outside accounting firms, all of whom describe it as a, quote, professional disagreement over accounting standards. What do you think?
It's more than that. This is an issue, and I think the title of our report says it all. It's an issue of transparency, accountability, and value for money. In terms of accountability, when a government makes a policy decision, the bottom line impact on the statement should be transparent, and the net debt impact should be transparent. The government should be transparent in the way it presents its financial information. And value for money, you know, I guess my question is, why would you structure this transaction so that it costs Ontarians more than it needs to? So
you can keep a balanced budget in the short run and fulfill a commitment to Ontarians that you're going to lower their hydro bills.
And that was the intent behind the structuring of this transaction. And I think in our report we have, and I would encourage people to look at it, there are two figures, one of what the transaction really is, and one of what it looks like in the way it was structured.
You know where that is in here?
I believe the tab marks it here. But so
which camera should I show this to, Sheldon? This one here?
This is the way, the first one, figure one over there, is the way that it normally is. The government needs to borrow money to pay the difference in what it pays the power generators under contracts versus what it collects from ratepayers. So it really is just borrowing money, and there's an interest impact, and there's a loss because the government is collecting less than it's having to pay out. That's the simple. And that's the substance of it, and that's what accounting says we should follow. And this is the way it's been structured. And there's transactions going back and forth between three entities in the government: the Independent Electricity System Operator, Ontario Power Generation.
You're calling it a shell game?
I'm calling it, an unusual way to reflect the fact that the only thing that's happening here is the government needs to borrow money and pay interest on that money to give the people the break on the electricity bills.
Okay, but, and we're down to our last minute here.
Yeah.
This electricity issue was going to defeat the government. I mean, you heard the complaints, everybody heard the complaints from all over the place. And the fact of the matter is, they figured out a way to lower electricity prices. We had Greg Lyle, a pollster on this program a couple of weeks ago, who says electricity prices are no longer one of the top three. It was number one. It's no longer one of the top three issues that people are concerned about. So this thing, which you don't like the accounting practices of, politically worked. It lowered electricity prices. It got all this borrowing off the books. It allows the government to say, in their view, they're still presenting a balanced budget. If they'd done it your way, they wouldn't have been able to achieve all of that. That's fair to say, isn't it?
I would say that doesn't necessarily work because, you know, why would you think that there's success if you have to pay more than you have to accomplish the same thing? And the same thing is giving people a rate reduction. So people can still have their rate reduction, but it didn't need to be structured in that way. And you know what? If there's a policy decision, it should show up on the government statements. Government should be accountable for their use of money. And so I think that's very important. I think people need to get good financial information from their governments. They expect it. And I think, you know, policy decisions, if they're made, they should be reflected in those numbers.
They don't like you. You're making their life crazy. You know that, eh?
You know, we're doing our job. Our job under the Auditor General Act is to report to the Assembly and the people of Ontario the facts of situations. You know, if you read that report, I believe that report is 100% accurate in the facts of the situation.
Auditor General, we always appreciate your visits to us here at TVO. Thanks so much for coming again.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit tvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.